Good evening, everyone. We're continuing with our class series. We're up to class number 77 on Swami Kriyananda's wonderful commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, based on his experience with Paramahansa Yogananda many years ago when Yogananda wrote this in the first place. Swamiji was a young monk and was there with him and worked with him a little bit on editing it, and many, many years later from divine memory primarily, Swamiji wrote this book with Master's explanations of the Gita. We are in a fairly esoteric section of the Gita, which is not my strong suit, so we'll see what we can pull out of it tonight by the grace of God, so prayer will be a little more fervent than usual. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Help us to feel your living guidance within. Open our hearts and minds to your kindness, to your wisdom, to your unconditional love. We are your children, making our way as best we can through this world you have created. Show us the way to happiness and fulfillment, to peace of mind, to joy. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, my friends, we are entering a new chapter of the book, which also happens to be simultaneously a new chapter of the Gita. So it's chapter 19 of the book, which is called Knowledge and Wisdom, and it's chapter 7 of the Gita. There are 18 chapters in the Gita, but they're not, we're getting close. It's evenly divided in the book. So, Chapter 7, stanza number 1 of the Gita. I started it the last session. I read through the first sentence. The Blessed Lord said, O Arjuna, hear how by following the path of yoga and absorbing yourself in my consciousness and taking shelter wholly in me, you will realize me wholly as I am, both in my infinite, unmoving self and outwardly, with all my attributes and powers. Knowing me thus, you will transcend every possibility of doubt. Now, whenever I read these verses, and bear in mind the Gita has been in existence for centuries, and it has been interpreted and reinterpreted, and lived by and studied and translated and retranslated. It's the you have two realities, two forces at work when you're dealing with scripture like this. One of them is the actual words themselves, the revelation of wisdom directly perceived that's just put into a few very pithy sentences that are really standing at the doorway of these enormous revelations. And that's how Scripture can endure for so many millennia. The Christian Bible, the Old Testament, it's because great masters and saints, they didn't really come up with clever ideas. They actually had an experience of a reality that is completely different than this one. And then they brought it down sufficiently to be able to put words on that experience. But it's not even as if the words themselves actually convey the experience, although they articulate ideas that are well worth studying. But in a vibratory sense, when you attune yourself to the words that they've written, you're able to attune yourself to the consciousness of the individual who perceived it. So you read the Gita, which is the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, and you have both Krishna and Arjuna present behind those words. Master made the statement that Babaji, whom he described in Autobiography of a Yogi as the deathless, ever-living master in the Himalayas, who even today lives in a physical body, a body which he is mystically able to maintain without, it doesn't decay, it doesn't age. And he lives with a group of disciples in the Himalayas. Many times when people read Autobiography of a Yogi, they forget Yogananda, they forget Sri Yukteswar, they forget many characters, but they rarely forget Babaji. They rarely forget this ever-living yogi in the Himalayas who presides over this reality. And one of Babaji's manifested incarnations when he lived among men, Yogananda said, was Krishna, which is why we always pray Babaji Krishna instead of just praying to Krishna by himself, because Master said it's the same jiva, it's the same soul. And Master said that he himself was Arjuna. So for disciples who are following Yogananda's path of self-realization now, I mean, one of the reasons that Master retranslated the Gita, and also he created what he called a literal translation, a clearer, more exact translation, and why it was so important to his incarnation is because he himself had been part of the genesis of this scripture. So we concentrate on these words, and many of the ways that people study the Gita, and in fact Sri Yukteswar trained Yogananda in this way, is you would read the verse and then you would meditate for a long time on the meaning of the verse, and then perhaps there would be some exposition on what the words might mean, and then you would meditate again on the meaning. And when we think of it in an intellectual way, you're sort of just like, well, you know, one word follows another and here's the logic of it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to penetrate past both the intellect and even the medium of words itself to the fundamental vibration. There's a wonderful book called I Was a Monk, and it's written by John Tetmer. And it's a very interesting book to read. John Tetmer was a Catholic, monastic. He became interested in becoming a priest and a monk when he was a young teenager. He was raised in a Midwestern American family, very devout Catholic. He just always knew his destiny was to enter a monastery and to become a priest. So he followed that destiny exactly, and because he was a brilliant, dedicated student, he became highly educated in Catholic theology, and eventually found himself living in Europe. He lived at the Vatican. He became more and more important in the whole structure of the Catholic Church. He loved what he was doing. He was born for it. He loved being a priest. He loved being a monk. He loved being a theologian. And he had so much zeal for the work that he did that he overextended himself. And he was sent by his monastic order on a sabbatical to Switzerland, to a sanitarium in Switzerland, where he could regain his health, because in his zeal he had neglected his physical well-being. So for the first time in his entire life, because he'd grown up on a farm in the Midwest where it was getting up early and doing chores before school and chores after school and then all of his scholarly work and so on, for the first time in his life he had nothing. He was forbidden even to follow his monastic ritual. He was ordered entirely to rest. So he sat, as he described it, on the balcony of his wherever he was in Switzerland, looking out at God's extraordinarily beautiful nature, and was just still for the first time in his life. And in that experience, in that opportunity, he had revelations about the nature of Jesus and the nature of spiritual life. Now you have to understand, a revelation is not an idea in this sense. A revelation is a direct experience. It was revealed to him. The illusion of this world, the curtain that the material world puts over the spiritual world, is moved aside. And you enter in to a different reality. You don't just hear about it or think about it, but you enter into it. All of us who have meditated deeply at any time, or been out in nature, or had some profound experience, know that there's a great deal of difference between thinking about something and actually being in it. My own experiences are limited, but I've had sufficient meditative experiences for me to know that there's such a thing as a change of consciousness. And you just know something is true, and it's not a matter of the mind at all. So when John Detmer had these revelations, he realized that everything that he called theology was really not true. That the nature of Christ and the nature of God was very different than all the intellectualizations he had studied so carefully, because the Catholic Church has had time to intellectualize and define everything. And he was heartbroken in a sense. And he said most people wouldn't have understood, because most people were not as highly educated in Catholic theology as he was. But knowing all those intellectual ins and outs, he realized that there were just words, and that God was something entirely else, and Jesus Christ was something entirely else. So he had to resign. He had to resign from the life he loved, because he felt he couldn't do it with integrity anymore. And interestingly, just for what it's worth, he ended up moving to Los Angeles, where he undoubtedly met Paramahansa Yogananda. Although nothing in his autobiography says that, he was exactly a contemporary, and some of his friends were disciples of Master. So it's impossible that they weren't connected. But that's less important. But here's the irony of it. He became an actor, and he played the part of spiritual people in the movies. He would play priests and holy men and saints, because he knew just how to do it. A very just fascinating life, but the most important part of it was that difference between how mankind tries to explain the revelation and the revelation itself. So when I go through the words of the Gita, it's not like I can understand what every word means, but every time I do, certain words always strike me, and they're not necessarily what Swamiji pulls out in the commentary, so do not in any way think that what I say is a substitute for it. But it's my sincere window, sort of from where I'm sitting to what I'm trying to understand. And inasmuch as this book has been studied and commented on for so long, one of the reasons is that it speaks on every level, and so it speaks to everyone on the level on which it's intended. Now, of course, I just had an interesting thought, which is only parallel to the Gita, but it seems obvious. At the end, toward the end, in the last years of Swamiji's life, he became persuaded that Master himself had also been, in a previous life, Jesus Christ, which is, of course, an extremely controversial thing to say. And when Swamiji had that intuition when Master was living, he asked Master the question, were you Jesus Christ in a previous life? And Master said, what difference would it make? which was a kind of non-answer. But it's also true that if Master had even hinted that that was his reality when he was living, it would have created so much controversy and would have subjected him to so much persecution and ridicule that he could never carry on his mission at all. But Master's commission was to reinterpret the scripture, the New Testament, and to reinterpret the Bhagavad Gita. And he said boldly that the Gita was a conversation between Babaji and himself as Arjuna, as Krishna and Arjuna. And so if you add in even the possibility, which I have no reason to doubt Swami's statement, because he wouldn't have made it if he didn't have good reason to make it. So there's Master also bringing up to date an understanding of what he himself taught in a previous incarnation. I know for some of you who will eventually listen to that, even that claim, maybe more than you feel comfortable with, and I can only present it as Swami's declaration. I have every reason to believe Swami and no reason to doubt him. And it just adds an interesting dimension to everything that we do. So all of this is because when I'm reading through this, and he says, and taking shelter wholly in me meaning the capital M, Krishna speaking in the divine. And I realized that I was very struck by that phrase, taking shelter. At this particular moment in my life, just personally speaking, I have a lot of different energies coming from a lot of different directions. And as is often my unfortunate karmic habit, I don't always endure periods of time where there's a lot of different pressures on me with complete equanimity, which is an understatement, but nonetheless you can understand what I'm saying. I am far less high-strung than I used to be, but nonetheless I notice in myself just a level of tension and a kind of background noise of concern or anxiety. Not sufficient to make my life impossible, but certainly sufficient to make my life less pleasant than I want it to be. And in the position that I'm in, having been a leader in this Ananda community for almost 36 years, and having people often come to me when they find themselves pressured from many different directions and not really knowing what exactly to do. And in recent times, I've had several women come to me who are facing issues that are not small. Issues having to do with dissolution of marriages, custody of children, restraining orders against spouses that are actually mentally unbalanced, tragic separations, seemingly unbearable catastrophes that yet have to be borne, often for the sake of children. And just as it happens, most of what I'm thinking of now has all been women and young children. That's by no means always the case, but that's what it is. And of course I try to be helpful and I try to be sympathetic. Swamiji gave us very interesting advice when we, as a collective, what I call my tribe, my generation of Ananda devotees, and a tribe is sort of the right word because we're a karmic group. Even within the greater Ananda, there are these karmic groups who are, mine happens to be the founding generation, where many of us were very nearly the same age, same background, coming to what was then the only Ananda village, and close to the same time, and banding together and having many profound experiences over the years, including the first 10 years when I lived especially in a group of 6 or 7 women where we meditated together almost every day for years. It just, this very strong energy gets built there. So just a moment, let me think why I was saying that. I somehow lost the thread of why I was going on that. I try to be helpful. Oh yes, Swami was teaching us when we were all in our 20s, early 30s, just beginning to do the work that has been lifelong now. Teaching us how to counsel people. And he gave a very interesting piece of advice, which of course I've remembered and meditated on often and recollected often. He says you should be very sympathetic to people when they come to you with sorrows and problems. It's not helpful just to offer spiritual platitudes with no feeling behind it. Well, if you just change your energy, you wouldn't have these problems. That could be the truth, but it's not always helpful. Fact is one thing, but truth, as Swami said, is always kind and is always uplifting. He said something also interesting about Master. He said, no matter how sternly Master might correct you, he said, you always felt encouraged. Even if his correction was severe, you always felt encouraged. He said, and whenever you feel discouraged, you know that it is Satan who is influencing you, not Master. And I would think to myself, how could Master criticize you sternly and have you still feel encouraged? Because it was the vibration of belief and support that he put into you. There's in the book I wrote about Swami Kriyananda, the first book, I've written 2 now. The first book was Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. And it's a shorter and an easier read than the second book, Light Bearer. Well, I won't say easier, but just different. It's just a collection of vignettes of individual experiences with Swami Kriyananda that I gathered from direct personal interviews with people and then wrote up in the first person, wrote up their experiences. This one woman, Nalini, she puts her name on the story, so some of them are anonymous. But she talked about how she struggled through her life with what she called crippling insecurity. And over the course of 50 years of spiritual life has transformed herself to a profound extent. She has been my friend. We arrived at Ananda village for the first time on the same day, which was August of 1970. She moved a couple of months before me, but we've always been together in this. And she described herself as having crippling insecurity. And she would go to Swamiji often for counseling, and the way she describes the story. And ever again, patiently, he would hear me, she would say, hear me describe to him the same issues, and he would always say, I believe in you, I know you can do this, Nalini, I'm sure you can do this. And he would give the same advice as if he'd never given it before, but always with this same commitment to her success. And she describes it so touchingly as his faith in her was like drops of water on a stone that gradually ate away her egoic self-preoccupation. Beautiful. It's a beautiful story. So when he was talking to us about how to counsel, he said, be very sympathetic, be very supportive. But he said, be sympathetic, but not too sympathetic. He said, if you're too sympathetic, you will increase the delusion in the person's mind that the problem they have is a really big one. Isn't that interesting? Like you're really facing something really terrible. I don't know how you're going to handle this. This is so tough. Wow, you're just really overburdened here. And it just makes them think that they are. It increases the delusion in their mind that what they're dealing with is overwhelming. But to be too unsympathetic, of course, never brings you what you want. So brings the result that you want. Personally, what I've found, and I learned it somewhat from Nalini's story, and learned it from Swamiji. I always felt from Swamiji that he never lost faith in me. I would lose faith in myself, but he never lost faith in me. It was vibratory as well as words, but it was mostly vibration. There was just a sort of a stalwart commitment to my ultimate victory. So I myself have tried to offer that. And sometimes I've been a little bit stern in my pep talk. You know, what choice do you have? You have to do this, especially when we're dealing with women and their children. You know, a woman who suddenly finds herself, you know, as the sole support of her children, it's very easy to feel completely overwhelmed. But what choice do we have? See, one of the powers that Swami said about success, what determines the difference between those who succeed and those who fail on the spiritual path. What is this? Fail is not the right word, but who may not persevere to the end, because we never fail. And I dealt with that a few sessions ago in the Gita, so I won't go into it now. But what is the secret of success? And Swami said the realization that it's a matter of life or death, and we have no choice. As long as you think you have a choice, you know, I could follow the spiritual path or maybe not. But if you get it into your DNA as deeply as you can possibly get it, that what choice do I have? Even if I do this badly, I have to persevere because I know where the direction of freedom and happiness lies. Now, all of that I've just been talking about is all about this phrase, and taking shelter wholly in me. That wonderful word, shelter, that's the word that struck me. It's when you think of being sheltered, you think of being protected from something that could otherwise injure you or defeat you or even kill you in some way. And so where do we look to take shelter? And he says just there, and taking shelter wholly in me. And it's a question of how do we solve the problems of our lives? Do we, well, the phrase Swami used once is, many people just wait to be rescued. And I know in some of the conversations I've had in the last few weeks, I could see an individual's desire to be rescued. You know, I see what I have to do. I see how very difficult it is. And instead of stepping into that challenge, I'm just going to sit here and hope to be rescued. I've certainly found it in myself. I mean, at different times I've had to just acknowledge that what I was doing was just sort of trying to outlast the difficulty until something took it away from me. There was a certain point in my own personal life where I had always thought, based on nothing in particular, that I would be involved in starting more than one community. I've actually been involved in starting two, which was Ananda Village itself and the community that we have here in Palo Alto. It had already, the seeds of it were already planted before I arrived here almost 36 years ago. But the real development of the rural community and the temple and the schools and so on, I've been involved in all of that. But I never expected to stay in this one place for so long. And there were several times over the course of the years where it seemed like Swamiji might assign me to another place. The East Coast, India perhaps, but in the end none of that happened. And about, I don't know, 15 or 20 years into it, Swamiji articulated the fact that even though he too had thought that these other assignments might be possible, that in fact I was never going to leave here. And it was extremely interesting when he said that to me, because I realized how many areas of my life, defined somewhat by the physical conditions, people that I didn't get along with, aspects of the project that I didn't know how to resolve, even literally a corner of the garden where I couldn't figure out what would grow there. Just places in the house that I was living in that were unsatisfactory for some reason. And I realized I was waiting to be rescued from all of them. That when I would see them, they would sort of cause a ripple in the force, and I would just turn away thinking, I'm going to get away from this. And it was a profound shift in my consciousness when I realized that at least geographically, I was never going to get to escape. Now that set in motion this whole series of realizations of how many other things in my life am I hoping just to outlast instead of actually to focus on. So then I'm in the position talking to newly single mothers who don't know how they're going to do it. And I just then think about my life for a number of hours today when there were just too many things pulling me in too many directions. But take shelter wholly in God. And what we need to take shelter from is not the things themselves, but the anxiety and the fear that is the as I said, that like the background static for a great deal of our lives. Swami often said that he never allowed anything to disturb his inward peace. And I heard him say that many times, and I have to admit that I've only recently begun to actually believe him. Because he worked hard and there were many stresses on his life. But to actually say that nothing ever disturbed his peace, that's really quite something to think about, because Swami always took shelter in the divine. It's like we live in this world, we act in this world, but it's the divine light surrounding me. There's an affirmation in his Affirmation and Prayers book that I have never fully understood how to embrace. It's I remain safe in the fortress of thy presence. I'm not saying it exactly, but the line that's relevant. I live secure in the fortress of thy presence, and nothing and no one can break through and harm me. And I can never use that affirmation because I don't believe it. I always believe that something can break through and harm me. Like war or pestilence or persecution or catastrophe of some sort or another. But I'm beginning to understand that it's not that no external event can break through, because even God doesn't promise that. I mean, God protects his devotees. Swamiji has a whole chapter in his autobiography, The Path. Master protects his devotees, and he has all these stories of miraculous protection that Master offered. People going up on a ladder and the ladder begins to tip backwards, and then all of a sudden it just goes forward again. And we've had numbers of events at Ananda Village. A man going down a steep hill toward the Yuba River, and the brakes on the truck go out, and he goes over the edge, and then some small bush holds the truck from plunging down into the canyon. A woman fell into a construction site and was injured. She fell onto a piece of rebar on the inside of her leg, the inside of her thigh. It was a bad accident. But by millimeters, no major artery, no major organ or part of her body was hurt. So she had karma to be injured, but the injury, which could have been catastrophic, was mild. Master said, those who love God are protected. So there is that there, but I could never believe that nothing and no one could break through and harm me unless I redefine what that means. Meaning that I have an inner fortress. I can always take shelter in God. And I've had a preoccupation, is actually the word I would say, which thankfully has faded. But for decades I had a preoccupation with the possibility of prison and the possibility of concentration camps. Partly I was born in 1947 to a Jewish family in El Paso, Texas, not in Europe. We had no relatives in Europe. All of our relatives had come out of Europe a generation or two before. But nonetheless, that was there. And I have probably been either politically active or religiously threatening. And so I have probably experienced prison and torture of various kinds in previous lives. I believe that's probably true, but I don't know for a certainty. But for whatever the reason, the concept of that kind of life, which I only recently learned that not everyone worries about it, but I have had to, for karmic reasons, who knows why. So I've always faced that challenge of how deeply and strongly within myself can I find security. And so one thinks of it in a big cosmic way, what could I endure? But sometimes the preoccupation with the grand causes you not to pay attention to the everyday. And the everyday is the background static of an unnamed anxiety, Whereas I can stand in a fortress of God's light and nothing and no one can break in and harm me. Swami Kriyananda can say, I never allow anything to disturb my peace. But you see how profoundly you would have to believe in God in order for that to really penetrate through the vrittis that just sort of chatter at you all the time. So here also what is interesting, taking shelter wholly in me, you will realize me wholly as I am, both in my infinite, unmoving self and outwardly with all my attributes and powers. This is where I say the book gets a little beyond me. Knowing me thus, you will transcend every possibility of doubt. So what is it that makes it impossible, or that I should say that makes it possible for one to feel vaguely anxious and incapable? It's because there's some doubt, isn't it? There's some doubt that God is in charge. There's some doubt that everything is happening according to God's will. There's some doubt that we are never alone, that we are wholly protected. Protected meaning that everything that happens, that God has never let go of our hands. It's very interesting to me, the juxtaposition of the word shelter and then the promise of overcoming all doubt. Now, I don't think of myself as a person who has doubts. I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. I recognized him instantly as I recognized his absolute central importance to my life instantly. I just knew that this was the personification, he was the personification of what I wanted to be. And that therefore there was only one thing I could do with my life, which was to learn from him how to be like him. And it took me a little bit of time because of the personal circumstances to actually move into the ashram, which I did on June 1st, 1971. I've remained continuously. I've never waffled off of this path ever. And I've never wanted to, and I've never doubted the choice. So I don't think of myself as a person with doubts in that external way. But the fact that I could have anxiety at all means that there's some part of this that I haven't really accepted deeply, despite all the experiences, despite everything. I mean, this is what, at least my experience here of the Bhagavad Gita, this is what it's telling me. It puts together words. There's a revelation that Krishna has because he's an avatar, and he's giving that revelation to Arjuna. Take shelter in me, and all doubt will leave you. And if all doubt leaves you, then all fear should leave you. All anxiety should leave you. All restlessness should leave you. Obviously, I don't fully take shelter because anxiety exists. And that even as the Curadar, the French saint, said, if you knew how much God loved you, you would die for joy. And if we know that God loves us, and we know that we are never alone, and just so many things in my life just work out. I've had just so many moments where thoughts would come. I was remembering just the other day that there was a point in my life when I was living in a very small trailer. Well, actually, I was living in a moderate-sized trailer at that point. But it was the only word for it is ugly. It was just ugly. And it just had it wasn't uplifting. It was wonderful because it allowed me to have the life that I really wanted to have. But in and of itself, it was not a magnetic environment. Partly because I didn't have the knack of making a magnetic environment. I didn't know how to do it. But I remember sitting there one day and thinking, this is not good for me. And it was just it was a true feeling that living in this environment is not really good for me anymore. I need a different environment. Now, one of the things that all of us founding members did with Ananda is, I put it this way, we never maximized our earning potential. Most of us were highly educated, came from relatively privileged backgrounds, could have followed any number of life's paths, all of which would have been more lucrative for us than the one we chose. But it was a conscious decision that we were putting our faith in God, and we were going to do something that was meaningful, and we just trusted that somehow the rest of it would work out. So my having the environment I had there at Ananda Village was entirely a financial decision. And I knew it was perfectly within my power to set my mind to acquire money, and I could have acquired money. But in order to do that, I would have had to redirect my energy away from helping to build Ananda, or at least to some extent from doing that, in order to acquire money so that I could create for myself a better environment. But even though I knew that for my own well-being, I needed a better environment, I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do it. So I said to Master, I hear you telling me what I need to do, but you see, you're giving me an impossible conundrum, so I can't do it. And about 9 months later, I had moved into this beautiful dome with this wonderful blue carpet with all these light windows, and it was this lovely, white color inside, and there were all these prisms that were casting rainbows on the wall. And I woke up one morning and I was looking at the white wall with the rainbows on it and the blue carpet, and it crossed my mind, oh my gosh, look, it happened. Totally unanticipated, none of it I knew about it, but I just gave it to God. And what I'm saying about that, I'm talking about there's a high level of faith, but if we're anxious about anything, our faith is not complete, which is another way of saying there has to be some doubt in it. So my personal practice for some period of time, but not today, has been to take shelter in God. If we're assailed by forces that we think we can't handle, we take shelter in the divine. And then if we continually do that, what we have is we have the experience of the divine power. That's what he's saying. if we actually give ourselves over, and this is the paradox of the spiritual path, is that if you hold back, then the magnetism is not necessarily strong enough to transform us, and if we're not transformed, we have doubts, so we hold back. And that's why it takes a long time. And that's why you just have to face into it, and this is again what I was saying to the women that I've been talking to. You just take it a day at a time. And God is no tyrant. You just put one foot in front of the other. And I can look back at times when I really thought I couldn't do it. But I did. Because what choice do we have? Meaning, we have all the choices in the world. We can always direct our lives any way we want to direct it. But if we deeply know what causes suffering and what's going to give us happiness, what choice do we have? We just know it's not going to work. And if we don't know it's not going to work, then we have to go out and try it, don't we? We have to test the waters over and over and over again. And then we reap the result of our own actions, and we find out. Which is what karma is about all the time. That's what's always happening. Karma is an unlearned lesson. What don't I yet know about the protective presence of God? And my mantra has been for some time now, why am I ever afraid of anything? And it's just, it's not a quick answer. But why am I ever afraid of anything? And this is where, having put forth the energy to really deeply understand these teachings is very helpful. Because my mind can't rationalize. It knows when it's lying. It can still lie. Meaning I don't what I'm trying to say is, I don't know why I'm still afraid, but I am. It just is. It's a fact. And there you have it. I remember when I was profoundly emotionally distraught over a situation I was in with a number of people, where people were suffering, and I was powerless to ease the suffering. And yet, I was the one people were looking to for strength. So I had to maintain. I had to hold on. I had to take shelter in God, and I had to hold on strong. But when I was completely alone, I couldn't sustain it anymore, and I was weeping uncontrollably. And in the midst of that weeping over the suffering of others, it wasn't I, in this case, who was suffering. I can weep over my own suffering plenty, but in this case it wasn't about me. And in that moment, a voice, and I always feel it like it was a moving voice, it came in my right ear, it went right through my consciousness and came out my left ear. The voice did. I know that's not how voices really work, but that's how it felt. It was like a magnetism passed through me. And it left the words, do you think this is happening outside the will of God? And I had to say, no, of course it's the will of God. I had to stop crying. If this is the will of God, then the obvious next question is, why are you weeping? And the answer was, because I'm exhausted and I don't know what to do. And so I changed my prayer into a prayer that has been very helpful to me ever since, which is, well, if this is your will, you'd better get on with it, because we're not able to handle much more, and I personally can't handle much more. Whatever you're trying to teach these people, you need to give them the capacity to learn it, because I myself can't endure much longer. And as it happened, when I rejoined the group, the entire energy had shifted and the healing that was necessary had started. Was the whole thing just for me? I don't know. Take shelter in God, and all your doubts will be resolved, because you will experience the power of that protection. That's what the Gita promises us. It's quite a promise. So, chapter 7, verse 2, I am about to unfold truth to you in its entirety, both as theory and as intuitively realized experience. Armed with this understanding, there will be nothing left for you to know in all the world. Don't you love this? This is a conversation. Krishna is telling Arjuna, look, I'm about to tell you something that's going to make your life different forever. I'm going to give you all knowledge, both the theory, which is the understanding of it in principle, and the realization of how that actually exists. And these are the two aspects of knowing. One is to understand it as an idea, and then the other is to have it as an experience, an inward experience within you. So he says, the Gita includes all aspects. He said, the theory as to why one should seek God, the methods, those which are best and those which are indirect, and those which are less praiseworthy for finding Him, and the nature of the goal itself. Why you should seek God, how you should seek God, and what it is that you seek. And when you put all of those together, then you have what the Gita has been for so long, which is a handbook for God realization. Then chapter 7, verse number 3, is this one. Among thousands of men, scarcely one strives for spiritual perfection. And among those blessed ones who seek me, scarcely one out of many thousands perceives me as I am. This is more often put, out of 1,000 one seeks. Out of 1,000 who seek, one finds God. This is actually worse. Because he not only says one, he says scarcely one. So out of thousands, among thousands, scarcely one strives for spiritual perfection, and among those who are blessed to seek God, scarcely one out of many thousands actually finds me. Now, Master's comment of even out of 1 out of 1,000, he said, our percentage is higher, is what Master said. He didn't say how much higher, he didn't give a new statistic, but he actually said that the coming, his incarnation, Yogananda's incarnation, he called it a special dispensation. I said to Swami, what does that mean? Does that mean that people actually get more than they deserve? And Swamiji said, to a certain extent, that is true. And Swami actually even wrote a little pamphlet, and I gave, in my 9 a.m. classes, I gave a long series on it. He called it a new dispensation, I think he called it. But it was about the unique power that has come to a focus in this particular line of masters, starting with the fact that we have 5 avatars. We have 5 avatars in a sequence of divine descent, of guru-disciple, culminating in Master Paramahansa Yogananda's coming to America in 1920. We have this transition from Kali Yuga into Dwapara Yuga, which is a very potent sort of time in the external world. We have all these forces of light and darkness coming together in an ever increasingly cataclysmic way. And all of it combines together to make this tremendous energy. We have the restoration in accessible knowledge of the technique of Kriya meditation, which is even described in the Bhagavad Gita as this most powerful method for neutralizing the energy in the spine and bringing our attention to the spiritual eye. And all of that is coming to a focus, like right now. So Swami just describes it as like a vortex, and that when you step inside that vortex, the magnetism of that vortex will help carry you. And we have Swami Kriyananda himself, who in many previous incarnations, a few that we know about, but undoubtedly in many, sort of adds magnetism to what Yogananda does, by taking the overarching revelation that Master brings and then making it specifically accessible. In the lifetime when Master was William and Swami was his son Henry, Henry created the system of law, and he after William passed, and eventually when Henry inherited it, for 30 years it was a period of peace and prosperity that was unprecedented at that time. And he built a systematic society of law and order and organization and attention to refined civilization. And when he was the son of Ferdinand III in Spain, and he was Alfonso X, once again he brought order, and he brought art, he brought science, he brought language. And as Swami Kriyananda, he wrote 150 books. And he also channeled this new kind of music, this new consciousness in music. And he started communities. And he wrote all of these books about how to be, if self-realization is the goal of life, how do you relate to everything else that you do? How do you relate to art? How do you relate to self-expression? How do you earn money? How do you raise children? How are you married? How do you design your homes? He went through everything that a person might want to do, and how do you do it from that perspective? And he made it all very accessible, not at all, sort of far away esoterica. And he even took Master's own writings, like this book, this commentary on the Gita, and edited it, wrote it in this case, but he was taking Master's own words and put them into very accessible form. And so all of that creates this opportunity, this unprecedented spiritual opportunity, which will continue and expand as time goes on. But therefore our percentage is higher. But you have to realize when you're dealing with this, among thousands, scarcely one even thinks about spiritual perfection. So if you just walk down the street in any city, any town, almost no one is genuinely seeking God. Some people may be religious, people may be ethical, they may be moral, or they may be just morally asleep. You see hundreds and thousands of people. When we were first here and we had our center, we now have a dedicated building, a beautiful temple. At that time we rented a retail space and we converted it into our temple. We made a sanctuary, we had Sunday school rooms, and it was just on the second floor of an office building. And on California Avenue, which is a street near where we live. And our temple is actually right near the same place, just a couple of blocks away. But for a long time in the early years, like in the early, let's see what it would have been. We came in 87, so it would have been the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. We were in that place for 7 years, or 6 years maybe. Across the street there was a nightclub, and it was called variously, but it was also called the Vortex at one point, and it was a Quonset hut. It's been long since torn down and new buildings have built, but there was this Quonset hut, and it was a nightclub, and it would they had live bands there, and they had pounding bass and pounding drums, which people apparently enjoy. And you would come out sometimes, like after an evening class or something, you'd stand on the sidewalk and you could actually feel the bass, going under the street, and you could feel it under your feet on the sidewalk. And sometimes I remember once I was riding my bicycle home and I went around behind it, and it was swarming. It was swarmed with people who were all trying to get in to the Vortex, and you could hear the pounding music there, and just to be perfect, almost all the people were dressed in black who were trying to get in. And I just realized, out of thousands, scarcely one is thinking about seeking God. All these people were moving in there to have the experience of that sensuality and the drinking and the flirtation and just all the things that they were doing. They weren't thinking about God. So if you're listening to this broadcast, by definition, you've already separated yourself enormously from those thousands and thousands. If it has even occurred to you to put even this much energy into seeking spiritual perfection, you're already at the end. You're already at the end of countless incarnations of other kinds of experiences. So perhaps, we won't be one of those scarcely one out of the many thousands, but our salvation is assured because we've put our feet on this path. And no matter how many times we don't quite succeed, and that was sections I was reading in chapter 6. There was a verse after verse about what happens if you make a sincere spiritual effort, but do not reach the final goal of final liberation, and all the positive good karma that will continue to carry you along. Now, Swami also talks about it. He says, these words might seem to sound discouraging. Who doesn't want to think his chances of success are all but non-existent. He also said that he's also talking about those who achieve God realization from the earth plane. He said, because most souls, you gradually overcome your material karma and then move into the astral worlds and then move even into the high causal worlds, and that God realization may be closer than we know, but it's not going to be directly from this earth life. Now, I can't really comment more about it, but Swami also modifies the discouragement factor by saying that. Let me see what else is here. He also points out that, and he said it earlier, but it's an important point, that well, this is the way Sri Yukteswar put it in Autobiography of a Yogi. First he said, the past lives of all men are dark with many shames, which is not exactly comforting, but it is comforting, which is to say we've all been through a lot before we get to the point where we've had enough experience of the alternative that the effort required to apply ourselves to the spiritual path, it looks better to us than continuing as we were. No, people will stick with something as long as the effort to change seems more painful than just continuing as they are. But if you are drawn to the spiritual path at all, it's because you've had enough other experience to be deeply serious about finding an alternative, and had enough inner experience to actually believe that spiritual life is the answer. So but Swamiji says, after Master says the past life of all men are dark with many shames, because we learn from failure and we learn from suffering, unfortunately. I wish that weren't true, but even just the little thing I was talking about today, about just that being aware of this background feeling of anxiety because of the many forces that were pushing on me this day. A desire not to feel like that is what pushes me to on a deeper and deeper level, to take shelter in God, to overcome whatever remaining doubts are in me that cause me not to trust that everything is happening by the will of God. And why would I allow any external circumstance to steal my peace? If I knew how much God loved me, I would die for joy. All of those realities, but when I'm outside of that, then the suffering of that just drives me to just try harder, because there's no other solution. No other. I mean, I'm not beyond watching a movie or anything like that. It's not like I can always go to the highest option. Sometimes I just have to, take a break in my consciousness. But deeper in myself is that knowledge that God is the only answer. And the reason I know that is because I've suffered. I suffered a little today. I've suffered a lot in the past. In this life, I've suffered a lot in past lives. And so all of that just drives us. That's why if you're thinking about spiritual perfection at all, you're a highly advanced soul. Because you have to compare yourself to the right realities. You can't compare yourself to St. Anthony of the Desert only. You have to compare yourself to all the other choices that you have repudiated, that don't even attract you anymore. Look how much I don't want compared to how much I do want. So Sri Yukteswar saying, they're dark with many shames, means that we've all suffered. We've all made mistakes, and we've all suffered. But then he says, everything in future will improve if you make a spiritual effort now. And this is how Swami says, it's not an all or nothing. It's not like I seek God, I don't find God, I go to hell. I mean, these are the crazy dogmas that people put out. You do this one little thing wrong, you go to hell for all eternity. It's craziness, and it's not true. It's among the many things that John Tetmer had to reject, was all this reasoning about how, sin and damnation and purgatory and hell and all these things. He just knew none of it was true. He experienced the reality of the divine and knew that none of those realities were true among the things he had to reject. So once we start making the spiritual effort, everything improves. If for no other reason than that we now know there is a solution. What happened when I met Swamiji, and I began to understand it earlier because I encountered the teachings of self-realization through Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda like 3 years before I met Swami. So I knew there was a truth, but I didn't know how to organize my life around it. And Swamiji showed me how to organize my life around it, because that's what he had done. And so what following this path gave me was a fixed point of reference. That's why I always think of Swami as my pole star. And it's just the perfect word for that. You can use the word guru, you can use the word teacher, and I sort of know what those words mean. But I see them more vividly when I use the word pole star. Because the pole star means the fixed point in the heavens that always tells you where you are and how to go forward. It's the single, unchanging reality around which everything else is understood. And prior to that, that was the most terrifying aspect of life to me, which was just I didn't know which way was forward, and I didn't know what I was seeking. Swami talks about the three things that Krishna talks about. He talks about why you should seek God, how you should seek God, and what the experience of God is like. I already knew why I should seek, why I should seek meaning, but I didn't know that it was God I was seeking. But I knew that life without meaning, without a pole star, was going to be a nightmare, and I didn't want to live it. So then the method, and then what the experience of the goal was, and that's when I saw Swamiji. I saw it personified. I saw that he was seeking God, that he somehow knew how to do it, and he manifested for me what the goal looked like. And here Swami talks about how it's not barren desert and then the oasis. And I love the way Swami puts it, the desert begins to bloom around you. which is to say, whatever you are doing begins to shine with the presence of the divinity, because it's not like God is far away. It's just that we begin to perceive it. Everything in future will improve, which is another way to overcome fear and anxiety and to take shelter in God. I'm loving you. I'm striving to do my best to follow the methods that will bring me close to you. And that's not only the practices of Kriya and meditation and so on, but also right attitude and devotion and courage and determination. I'm following the method that will lead to you, and I know everything in future will improve. Whatever today is, tomorrow will be better. Now, it might not be better because the problems are solved. Sometimes the problems get worse. But it will be better because it will just be one more day in which I have persevered. And if I can persevere for one day, I can persevere for two. And it begins to unfold in front of you. So, Swami also says that Krishna is not trying to discourage us, but he's trying, as he puts it, to stiffen our spines. And that is the dilemma of the counseling that I was referring to earlier. When I try to act it out for someone else, it also reminds me of what it is I am inwardly seeking. On one hand, I want sympathy. I want someone to feel sorry for me. I had a very funny experience, and sometimes Swamiji would make it fun to sort of pretend to have attitudes that were not really the most wholesome attitudes. So we would remember that they were a little bit of a joke, and it sometimes has often helped me to sort of exaggerate what might be a bad attitude that I might be inclined to have, but by just making a little bit of a joke out of it, I don't take it so seriously. Well, I was remembering, I was alone in the little house that I lived in at that time. It was at Ananda village, and we had a wood stove, and I dropped a heavy log on my foot, and it really hurt. It hurt so much that I was a little concerned that I might have even broken my foot. But I was all by myself, and the house was rather isolated, so there was sort of nowhere to go, but I had a telephone. So it must have been in the middle of the day. So I called the medical clinic, and a friend of mine, as it happens, it was Jack Wallace at that time who was working there, he answered the phone, and I told him that I dropped something heavy on my foot and I didn't know. And so he asked me a few questions that he was just a receptionist there, he wasn't a medical person, but he knew to ask a few questions that I could experiment and decide whether any bone might have been broken, and it wasn't. It was very clear pretty quickly that no bone was broken. So he'd solved the problem. My foot wasn't broken. But then I said to him, but I'm in pain, and I'm pitiful, and I'm alone. And he said, oh, you want someone to feel sorry for you. So then he started saying, oh, poor you, your poor foot, all by yourself. And he was a great actor, and he just went on for a number of moments, and then I was pathetic, and he was pathetic, and we were pathetic together. And then, of course, we both started laughing, and it was fine. I bruised my foot, but it was nothing more. But I wanted somebody to comfort me. And it was minor enough that I wasn't, desperate with all my being needing to be comforted. But I was in pain, and I was suffering, and I wanted somebody to feel sorry for me and to comfort me. And so I've learned, when someone else comes to me with difficulties, I'm just looking in the mirror. Today it's them coming to me, tomorrow it's me coming to them. It's just the way spiritual life works. We have easier and harder days. But there's always that balance point that I know you want somebody to acknowledge that you are facing a very hard time and this is very challenging for you. I mean, I dropped a piece of wood on my foot and I had to call somebody to sort of whine with me for a couple of minutes. I mean, what does a person do who's facing some overwhelming life challenge that's going to take a decade to get through. You know, to acknowledge that you're really up against something in yourself or for the sake of others, it can be very helpful, because at least then you know I'm not alone and I'm not crazy. This really is something. But also what we have to do for each other is we have to stiffen each other's spine. And that's how Swami says Krishna's trying to stiffen our spine for the real challenge of the spiritual path. You know, you're not just going to float your way to heaven. Out of 1,000 who seek, only one, you know, really puts out the energy to get there. Well, make yourself that one. This is not easy, but you can do it. You can do it. I know you can do it. Besides, what choice do you have? You know, I was very touched when someone said quite simply, you know, it's just not that easy to lay down and die. Sometimes we just really want to lay down and die, but you lay down and die, and after a while you get a little hungry, you get a little uncomfortable, you get a little curious as to what that odd noise is across the street. You know, whatever it might be, you're just trying to die, but you can't, because the life force within you keeps pushing you. So we need to sort of have that friendship with ourselves and friendship with each other. I mean, when I talk about how I relate to someone else, I'm also talking about how I relate to myself. You know, I can acknowledge that I'm overwhelmed, that this seems like too much to me. And, you know, and I can sit there for a few moments in that. But then the practical side of me will just say, well, what are you going to do? You know, you have to go on, you have to face it. And so then there's this sort of kind of stiffening of the spine that comes, and that's what Krishna's trying to do. He's not trying to discourage us, but only to stiffen our spines with a challenge not to dabble with one finger in shallow waters. The spiritual path is for heroes, not for cowards or weaklings. And there you have it. You know, it can't be changed, because every limitation that we have has to be faced and overcome. And then Swami also talks about, you know, in the commentary here, he talks about, he writes in a way that he used to speak a lot of the time, that I used to find it very, very difficult, because he would speak in very sort of sweeping terms about how completely unsatisfying life is really for everyone. And there would be just so much in me that would want to say, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not. And I didn't really have enough life experience or any solid foundation for doing that. I was just frightened. I was just frightened when he would talk that way. It was too big and it was too much for me. I just wanted to bring everything down to a more manageable level. And so Swami addresses that issue in here, like, why is it, you know, that out of thousands only one seeks, but are the others really taking the better path? And the other reason he puts this in here, because this is the stanza that's supposed to stiffen our spines. And if we imagine, oh, that person over there with that nice home, and that person over there with the good career, and that person over there with all the friends, you know, or that handsome husband, or whatever it might be, they have it, their lives work really well. Why am I trying so hard for spiritual perfection? I could just settle back and do what they're doing. So Swami just speaks unequivocally, you know, they're not happy, they're not fulfilled. They pretend to be happy, they hope to be fulfilled, but they aren't. Because when we're just looking superficially, the spirit is ever restless. And this is why once we start on the spiritual path, it's very hard to turn back. It's just very hard to turn back, because we've come to understand the sort of transitory, superficial nature of life without a deep inner life. See, this is what this is about, which is, do I have a deep inner life? It's not whether you have the beautiful home and the handsome husband and the nice career and all of those things. You can do anything, but you can either do it with a deep inner life, or you can just try to seek your satisfaction from all of those external things. And that's really what we're talking about. And the other side of it is, life is inherently disappointing. It just is. Because you can't get infinite satisfaction from finite experiences. And our souls are made for infinity. And this is a very deep, I've said these words for many years of my life, but only more recently have I just simply had enough life experience to really understand what Swami was saying all that time ago. Though so many things that Swami said to me, so many experiences I had with him, I didn't reject them because I never could reject what he said. He had proven himself beyond a shadow of a doubt to me in terms of his wisdom and his truthfulness in everything he said. And I would accept it, I would say, on the level that I was capable of accepting it. But as years and experience pass, experience accumulates and years of experience accumulate. I very often say, oh, that's what he meant. Even just where I started this evening, I never allow anything to disturb my inner peace. He meant that literally. I never allow anything to disturb my inner peace. Wow, that's quite a promise. And it takes more than I have achieved in order to reach that. And Swamiji's repudiation of the possibility of happiness without God is something also that one has to take deeper and deeper. Now, bear in mind, it's not that one is saying that the world is horrible and that no positive experience is possible. It's much more subtle than that. This is why Swami said, we learn from having our desires thwarted, but we learn more from having our desires fulfilled. Because if our desires are thwarted, we always imagine that they would give us this, we have an imaginary idea of the degree of happiness that the fulfillment of those desires would give us. So if they're thwarted, we just keep longing for the experience. If the desire is fulfilled, then we know exactly how much happiness it will give us, which is some. It's not nothing, but it's not enough. This is why people who are struggling to establish themselves in the world at all almost never get interested in the path of self-realization, because it tells us that desires are not going to fulfill us. But if your desires have only been thwarted, you say, it's easy for you to talk. What do you know? You've gotten everything already. So it tends to be the people who follow this path, especially in the West, are people who've had a great deal of what worldly success has to offer. Not necessarily in this lifetime, but we're not impoverished. We can understand just how much that way of life will give us, and we don't hate it, but we know it's not enough anymore. And that's where the real power of spiritual seeking comes from. This is beautiful, but I know there's a greater beauty, and that's what I'm seeking. So my friends, God bless you.